obsolete, and then we shall go into Unicode and better ways of transcribing all the languages of the world. This is not just Sanskrit, it's all the languages of the world, okay, globally. So I don't have anything to say. If there are no questions, are there any questions at this point? Then I shall hand the floor to Peter, who will not contradict me too much, I hope, but give more details. I will just point out that Emma was typing her password. Yes. So there is a lot of information in this password. See, if the password had been printed in front of you, then you would have got a lot of information. How to get on all your files, madam. Yes. So instead, what you got is ... So you get no information out of it. Yes.
So what we see here on the board is several different ways of representing Sanskrit language, right? 6 different ways of representing Sanskrit language. Actually, there are 7 different ways of representing Sanskrit language there, including the numbers, right? Now, earlier today, I did a little experiment, didn't I? I asked each of you to write 4 words. We had Shiva, Parvati, Krishna, and Radha. Now, there were 32 responses. And 18 of the 32 represented, I guess I'll erase this, even though some of it will be useful again. I'll have to write it over, since there's only so much space here. I'll start over. So these characters include the following letters: a, I, K, more or less in Sanskrit alphabetic order, K, N, T, Dha, Pa, Ra, Va, Sha, and Sh. Okay? Now, most of the responses, 18 out of the 32 responses, excuse me, 18 out of the 32 responses represented these sounds in this way. Okay, I'll put 18 up here. They represented by also by I by I also by I. Okay. By Ri, Ka, Na, Ta, Dha, Pa, Ra, Va, Sha, and again Sha. Okay. Is there a problem? There's a problem. What's the problem? Why is there a problem here? Yes. What's your name? Sarthik Chaitanya. Sarthik. No difference is shown. There's no differences shown. Both of these come out the same. So we ended up with Shiva, Parvati, Krishna, Radha. We don't really know whether this is Parvati or Parvati. Okay. We don't know whether it's Radha or Radha. Or Radha or four possibilities, yeah. So there's ambiguity, right? We can't tell by reading this what the speech forms actually were, right? The graphic representation here does not adequately, unambiguously represent the speech sounds which were uttered. The written form, the script, does not adequately represent the spoken form or the language. Okay? This is an inadequate encoding. This is an inadequate encoding scheme for the Sanskrit language. And it's inadequate because it's ambiguous. Now, some others, there were nine people used some diacritic marks. Gerard mentioned that we can... first of all, why is it? Why is it that this is ambiguous? Because this is built on Roman letters. Roman letters were used originally to represent the Latin language. The Latin language had a certain set of phonemes. Gerard mentioned phonemes. Phonemes, what did Gerard say a phoneme is? Someone say what a phoneme is? Yes. Basic unit of sound. Anything else we need to add to that? I mean, an acoustic technician might say there's other ways of representing basic units of sound, right? An acoustic technician might represent basic units of sounds in terms of parameters of volume, pitch, and timbre, right? So do we want to add something to that definition? Basic unit of sound for whom? For whom? A basic unit of sound. A phoneme is the basic unit of sound for a speaker of the language, right? For a human being who naturally comprehends that language. And a phoneme is never defined in isolation. You always have a phonemic system, right? There's always a system of phonemes which represents the basic distinctions that speakers of the languages make between sounds. So phonemes don't exist in isolation. They exist in a system of distinctions that speakers of the language make. And a phoneme within a system of phonemes is the basic unit of sound necessary to distinguish meaning. There are further distinctions of sound which could be made, right? One can distinguish between ha and ha in Sanskrit, between sakadati, sahakadati, and sahkadati, with a ha, a velar fricative, right? Velar fricative is a jivhamuliya, right? Now, there is no phonemic difference between a jivhamuliya and a visarga, but there is a phonetic difference. Right? The phonetic difference, it sounds different. Ha sounds different than ha, but there's no meaning difference. There's no significance to that difference. There are no lexical items in the language, no lexemes, no basic words or units of meaningful speech that differ on the basis of there being a visarga here versus a jiva muliya there, right? But there are differences between bala and bala, right? This means strength, and this means boy. They're two different meanings. So short a and long a are two different phonemes in the language because they are basic sounds on the basis of which there is a distinction in meaning. So that's what a phoneme is. A phoneme is the basic unit of speech on the basis of which there is some distinction of meaning. Now, meaning is a slippery thing, right? This is an obvious case where there's distinction in meaning. But there are other cases where it's not so obvious. It was obvious that visarga and jiva muliya do not make a distinction, and it's obvious that a and a do make a distinction. There are other cases where it's not so obvious whether a distinction is made or not. So, for example, between anuswara and an M, okay? Is there a distinction in meaning? You can write sangama or sangama, right? And they both mean the same thing. So there's no distinction of meaning made there. Now, some people argued that anuswara is not a phoneme in Sanskrit. Now, is anuswara a phoneme or not? Well, what about samrat? Can we also say samrat? No, it's not correct. This is not correct. So although we can't find a specific instance like this, where there's a distinction made just on the basis of the alternation of M and anuswara, we can find instances in the language where you can only use one versus the other. So in fact, this is a phoneme. M is a phoneme. Anuswara is a phoneme if we're very strict about it. But it's only marginally a phoneme. There are only a few lexical items in the language that allow us to perceive this difference. So there are phonemes, there are non-phonemes, and then there are marginal phonemes. They are phonemes, but very marginally. And then it can be argued that in cases like this, that, well, maybe in those marginal cases, those words don't really belong to Sanskrit. Maybe they belong to some other language. It's possible to argue that kind of thing. So, for example, something like yajuhu karoti. Okay, he performs, or, well, maybe I should say rajuhu patati. Okay. Anyway, that's by yaju karoti. He makes some, or composes a yajus. Now, we're told that this basic lexical item here is yajus with an S, right? Now, in Vedic texts, we don't find yajuhu karoti. We find yajush karoti, right? So there's a difference in the context in which visarga is used versus the context in which a sha is used. And that difference of context is that the sha is used in Vedic and the visarga is used in loke, right, in ordinary speech. So some people have argued that that here you could say, well, we can say, look, Sanskrit is one language. There's no difference between the language of Vedic and the language of ordinary Sanskrit. It's one language. And there's a meaningful difference here. The meaning here, although they both have the same semantic implication that one should compose some Yajus formula, there is a different sense in a more vague way, contextual sense. This one gives the contextual sense that it's Vedic. And this one gives the contextual sense that it's ordinary speech. So there is some difference in meaning. It's not a lexical meaning, but there is some different sense there. So the question comes up, in an encoding scheme, what meaning do we want to represent? So it's not just the case that one can say a phoneme is the basic unit of language, of speech, on the basis of which a distinction of meaning is made. One has to say what meaning. And one has to decide what meaning one wants to convey with that language, what distinctions one is interested in conveying. So it's an informational science question. Informational science is not arbitrary. It's always with regard to what information one wants to convey. Now here's somebody videotaping my speech. There are some significant elements in my speech, and there are some insignificant elements. Now, some of what I'm doing today is going to be picked up on that tape, and some of it is not going to be picked up. It's not going to be picked up, for example, how I smell. Okay? That's not going to be picked up here, is it? Is it relevant? Does anybody care? You're sitting far enough away, so you don't care, right? Nobody cares. Nobody cares what he smells like. We care what he's saying. The sound is being picked up. Okay, I'm making lots of gestures. Are those gestures really relevant? Couldn't we just as well make an audio recording and leave out the picture altogether? Wouldn't that be good enough? Wouldn't that capture all the information we want from this speech? So there's a question about what information is relevant to display. One can convey knowledge in different ways. One can go to a performance of Kathakali, and a lot of the information will be displayed in gestures. And in that case, the gestures are significant. And if one didn't see the gestures, one wouldn't catch the meaning, right? So in that case, the visual phenomena are informationally significant. They make significant distinctions. So knowledge can be displayed, knowledge can be communicated in various ways. It can be communicated through speech, it can be communicated through motion, it can be communicated through static visual display. All of these are different methods of conveying knowledge. People who are deaf rely on visual means and gestures and so forth to convey knowledge, to convey that information. Those who are blind rely solely on audio methods and touch for conveying knowledge. So information is displayed in different ways as a primary method of conveying knowledge. And then there are secondary methods of conveying knowledge, right? A performance reviewer can go to a Kathakali performance and write a review of that, describing the performance in a written mode for a local newspaper. Okay, and he translates some of what was conveyed by motion and by visual signs into written speech. So his representation of that performance is a secondary representation of activity, which was the primary mode of information communication. Similarly, the primary mode of representation of language is through speech. And writing, which came later, as Gerard mentioned, in the history of the media of transmission of knowledge, writing came later. The oldest written documents in Sanskrit dates back to about the 2nd century. The oldest writing in India dates back to the Ashokan inscriptions in Prakrit language, right, to 323 BC. I'm sorry, Ashokan inscriptions, 226, something like that, BC. And yet we know that Vedic recitation is 1,000 years older than that. So oral means were the primary means of transmission of knowledge in the Sanskrit language. Later, that was transmission. The oral transmission was represented in speech. It was represented in script. First in Brahmi Script, or a Koroshti Script. Later in various modifications of those scripts, which were further modified into the many scripts we have in modern India today. All of the local scripts for all of the languages in India are derived from Brahmi script, with one exception, Urdu. Urdu script is derived from Persian script. Now Brahmi script itself was derived from it was invented probably by somebody hired by the Emperor Ashoka. And he probably had some ideas inspired by Koroshti script. And Koroshti script itself is a modification of a Middle Eastern script, probably Aramaic. Now, Middle Eastern scripts obviously were representing other languages. They were representing, Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. So in the same way that Roman script is being adapted with diacritic marks to represent Sanskrit language by Sanskrit scholars, first by Sanskrit scholars in the 19th century, and by us now. Similarly, in ancient times, Koroshti script was modified to represent Prakrit from the scripts originally used to represent Arabic and Aramaic. And Brahmi script underwent evolution. Brahmi script was invented to encompass a wider range of phonemes, originally for the Prakrit language. But Brahmi script originally did not have any signs for certain sounds that occur in Sanskrit but do not occur in Prakrit, i.e. in ao, for example. Vocalic r, vocalic l, ol. These sounds do not occur in Prakrit, and there was no way of representing them. So we have in Brahmi script evolved, however, and modern languages have certain signs we have this sign to represent a. We have this sign to represent a. To represent o, do we have a native sign? Not really. Isn't this a composite? Just as we write ko, and this represents ka, and this represents o, why doesn't this represent a plus o? It doesn't, right? And yet the graphic mark is the graphic sign that used to represent a, plus a diacritic mark, which usually comes on consonant signs, added to it, right? So the script was adapted to represent this O sound. And similarly, to represent I, we add a diacritic. That diacritic occurred elsewhere, here, to represent ka plus a. And here it represents an open diphthong, I, which in Roman, again, we represent by two signs, right? So what I'm getting at is that just as the modern diacritic system, I didn't finish my experiment discussion. Let me go back to that experiment discussion for a moment. 9 people used some diacritic marks to help disambiguate these Roman signs to more exactly represent the Sanskrit sounds. So how did they do it? Well, they used a macron, a line above, to represent long vowels. And they used a dot below to represent retroflex sounds. They used, I did that wrong. This one we want. They used an accent mark, which is often used as an accent mark above palatal sign to represent the palatal there. And they used a dot. Some other people use a circle, open circle, underneath to represent a vowel R as opposed to a consonantal R. And similarly under retroflex N. Any others I miss? I think that's it, right? So these diacritic marks are additions made to the script to accommodate phonemes in the Sanskrit language that don't exist in Latin or didn't exist in Latin, and so weren't necessary. The Latin script was adequate to represent the phonemes of the Latin language, to represent all the distinctions made in the Latin language, but the Latin script is not adequate, was not adequate to represent the phonemic distinctions in the Sanskrit language. With the diacritic marks, however, it becomes more adequate. Okay? I say more adequate because it's not perfect. Okay? But it's sufficient to convey the distinctions. Whether it conveys those distinctions in an ideal manner is another matter. So similarly, the Devanagari script evolved from Brahmi, which was originally meant to represent Prakrit, but additional modifications were made to that script to accommodate sounds in Sanskrit which originally did not belong to Prakrit. So the Devanagari script itself is an inadequate encoding. It's not entire. Well, it's adequate. It's adequate in the same way diacritics are adequate when added to Roman script. It's adequate to represent all the distinctions of the phonemic system of Sanskrit, but it's not ideal. It's not an ideal method of representing the sounds of the Sanskrit language. It's a script. Devanagari script is not Sanskrit script. There's a difference between Sanskrit and Devanagari. Devanagari is used for Marathi, it's used for Hindi, it's used for Gurmukhi, right? It can be used for a lot of things. It's used for English, right? Right? Right, yeah. I don't know how to spell Air India, but anyway, something like, right? You can spell English words in Devanagari. When I was learning Hindi, it was really funny. The words that were hardest for us to recognize were the English words. What is computer? Computer kya hai? Oh, computer. Oh, you mean computer. So what I'm getting at is that there's a difference between script and language. Script is a written representation. It's a secondary representation of spoken phenomena, and it may not be an ideal representation. So even this Latin encoding with diacritics is not an ideal representation of Sanskrit, and even Devanagari is not an ideal representation of Sanskrit language. So if we want to ask ourselves, what are we encoding? And when we come to deal with Sanskrit computational linguistics, when we're handling Sanskrit language computationally, what do we want to represent to the computer? Do we want to represent Devanagari script to the computer? Do we want to represent Romanization to the computer? Or do we want to represent Sanskrit phonemics to the computer? If we're doing linguistic processing, we really don't care whether Sanskrit was written in Devanagari or Romanization or Gujarati script or any other script. Malayalam script, Tamil script, Grantha script, or what else can I imagine? Or Persian script. You know, there are some works in Sanskrit that were originally written in Persian script. Sanskrit language written in Persian script, yes. So, we don't care about that. If we're representing Sanskrit language, we want a representation of the language, not of the script. So why should we represent an imperfect representation in Devanagari or Romanization secondarily or tertiarily, right? Because the knowledge was expressed in Sanskrit language. The language was written in some script, and then we're going to represent that script into some computer encoding. We're getting quite far. We're making a lot of transitions, departing, and each step of transition is departing further from the original knowledge that was expressed. If we want to capture the knowledge, if we want a precise representation of the knowledge that was being expressed, we should try to go back closer to the source of that knowledge. So rather than representing to the computer some mode of the script, why not choose an encoding that represents the language itself directly, rather than the script? So, Gerard mentioned that Unicode is going to solve a lot of problems. It's going to solve some problems. It's going to solve the problem that one doesn't have to translate or transcode, I'll say. One doesn't have to transcode from one script to another anymore, because all of the world's scripts will be represented by unique codes to the computer. We can go directly to the code to represent that script. But Unicode's principle is to represent scripts. Unicode does not represent languages. It represents scripts. But if what we're interested in doing is representing language, we want to represent Sanskrit language, we don't really care what Unicode does. We might look at Unicode and ask the question, is there a Unicode representation that is adequately representing Sanskrit language? Or is there a Unicode representation which is ideally representing Sanskrit language that we would like to use? Well, let's look at what Unicode does for a moment to represent Sanskrit language and ask ourselves whether it's ideal or not. So there are a number of faults which come to the fore that are not simply faults of encoding schemes in representing language, but faults of the scripts themselves. Let's look at this diacritic scheme, okay, which seemed to be a very precise method, an adequate method of making all the distinctions necessary, and see whether it really is ideal. There are some problems in the representation. So this is what's called. Let me first start with some abstract principles. The ideal method of representing anything is to have a one-to-one correspondence, right? A one-to-one correspondence is the simplest method and unambiguous method for representing something else. No matter what it is, right? Any objections to that? Any question about that? Right? If one has to represent one thing by two things, then it's complicated. If one has to represent, one represents two things by one thing, it's ambiguous. Ambiguous and prolixity are both false. So an ideal encoding scheme for any knowledge whatsoever, any information whatsoever, is one-to-one representation. Do we have one-to-one representation? Do we have ambiguity? Are the two questions we should ask. Well, in a Romanization of Sanskrit, we have some complication here. It's not the simplest method. We're representing a single phoneme, dha, by a digraph. There are two graphic marks representing one single phoneme. And there's some ambiguity here. There's ambiguity because this H here, what is this H representing? I mean, there's the Devanagari A ha, which is supposed to be represented in Romanization by H. In this case, H is representing the same phoneme that ha is representing in the Sanskrit language. Is this H representing that phoneme? No. No, it's not. What is it representing? Well, we have that H in ta, dha, cha, ja, right? And many others. What is that H representing here? Anybody? Mahaprana. Mahaprana. What is Mahaprana? Is that a phoneme? Is Mahaprana a phoneme? Anybody? What's the opposite of Mahaprana? Alpaprana, right? We have Mahaprana, Alpaprana. And we have some other things like this, other terms like this. Some other terms in that ballpark? Anybody? Gosha, Goshavat, Agoshavat. Huh? And we have Kantya, Talavya, right? Murdhanya. What are these things? What are these? What are we talking about? Are we talking about phonemes? No. What are we talking about? We're talking about features of sounds, right? What? Vocal seats. Well, okay, those 5 were vocal seats. Those are sthanani, right? Sthanas. But altogether, sthanas, prayatna, abhyantara prayatna, bahya prayatna, all of these things are features of sounds. Features are characteristics of sounds that, taken together, can uniquely describe the set of phonemes. Some people like to say that phonemes are bundles of features. Well, they're not really bundles of features. Features are systematic descriptions of, they're characteristics that uniquely describe aspects, certain aspects of sounds. So the ha here is representing a feature rather than a phoneme. So what we have here in this Romanization is a mixture of what we're representing. Here the H represents a feature, and here the H represents a phoneme. So this encoding scheme is inconsistent in its basis. There's an inconsistent basis to the Romanization of Sanskrit. Some graphic marks are representing features, and the same graphic marks are doubling up in other cases as representing phonemes. This is a mess. You have to ask, the guy who invented this, what do you want to represent? Do you want to represent phonemes or do you want to represent features? And the guy's saying, well, I don't know, I just, want to use some lines to mark some distinctions. We don't want to deal with that kind of confusion. Let's be absolutely consistent. Let's invent an encoding scheme for Sanskrit that uses only features or uses only phonemes, right? That would be a consistent way to come up with an ideal method of representation of the Sanskrit language, right? Rather than having this double up. So we have a similar problem with the romanization of diphthongs. We have aye and ao. Well, sometimes is used to represent, well, we had the word bala, right? Sometimes is used to represent the phoneme a. Sometimes it's used to represent a subsegment, or what do you call it? Sanyukta-akshara? No, that's not the word used. What do you call? Huh? What? The parts of the diphthongs. What are they called? No. Parts of diphthongs. I, in the sound I, there are two sounds, right? A and E. Do we call these sanyuk? Sanyukta-akshara? No, sanyukta-akshara is used for consonants. Yeah, anyway, this term is slipping my mind. But anyway, we call them in English subsegments. Okay, they're not independent segments, they're parts of the diphthong. And in other cases, we have something like we have mana icha and we have taihi. Okay? In the romanization, we get something like this. In both cases, we're using ai. In this case, is it manaicha? Is this manaicha or is it manaicha? Manaicha. The a and the e are representing separate phonemes here, and they're representing a diphthong here. So we have a digraph representing one phoneme here, and we have the same marks being used in a different way. This is ambiguity, right? This is ambiguity, yes.
In the second example, there is no such word, so there is no ambiguity.
Here?
There is no word manaicha.
Sure there is. The desire of the mind. It's in the dictionary.
That is,
Yeah.
it can't be in between.
It's a compound.
It cannot be a vowel.
It's a compound. It's a compound.
It's a compound word, then the sandhi has to happen.
No. No, sandhi has already happened. We had manaha, icha, and then the visarga before a vowel disappeared, and then we're left with mana icha, right?
It's actually a compound word.
Right, it's a compound word.
I don't think there is a word manaicha.
Yeah. It's a compound word. Samasta shabda. Samasta shabda koshe vartate. Vartate. Also we get prauga, if you want to.
The problem is,
Okay? Prauga versus praudha. Okay? Here praudha is a diphthong. Prauga is not a diphthong. So this is ambiguous, right? It's not an ideal. So the romanization itself is not an ideal encoding of Sanskrit, right? One could disambiguate this by using what's called a diaeresis here. 2 dots above. Those 2 dots would signify this is a separate sound, this is not an identical sound. But then in some cases we use in some cases this to represent the phoneme E, and in other cases we just use this without the diaeresis to represent. So we have 2 different ways of representing one sound. Right? That's redundancy. Redundancy is Gaurava. It's not an ideal system. Laghava is good, Gaurava is bad, right? Pratipati Gauravam vartate atra. So, let's look at Devanagari now. Devanagari has some difficulties too. It's not just Romanization that has a problem representing Sanskrit. Even Devanagari has some difficulties. So this is up now? I gave you plenty of time. I had a long diversion here.
I think my system is now
Dominating.
It's in the queue of crashing.
Oh no.
Bus is crashed.
Uh-oh.
So I'm just waiting.
But I thought it was on her
For
machine.
it not to be crashed.
But I thought it was on Preeti's.
No, there is no projector connection.
Oh.
So we have.
So you had to move it to your machine.
Yes, but my machine is not getting booted. It is
All right.
continuously this checking.
Go- Koi baat nahi.
No.
All right. Never mind. Never mind. Okay. So what Unicode does, Unicode represents sounds. Atra dhyanam astu. Unicode has letters E, right, etc. And it also has these diacritic marks, these vowel signs separate, right? Well, let's move this one down. It has these signs, right? Okay, so we have two ways of representing the same sound, the same phoneme in Sanskrit, in Devanagari script, right? The Devanagari script has some redundancy here, right? Unicode has some redundancy. Unicode is not an ideal method, therefore. It's adequate, but it's redundant. Redundant means Gauravam. And similarly, in the representation of, we have what does this represent? Law, right? As in Kalhana. And we, let's see, what else do I want to come up with here? Okay, so we have, first of all, we have something like Agamat. Here we're representing the absence of a by a mark, and the presence of a in this ma, right? The presence of ma by the absence of a mark, and the absence of a phoneme by the presence of a mark, right? It is ulta ho gaya. So this is strange, isn't it? And here we're using a digraph to represent a single phoneme. And here we have ambiguity. So Devanagari has some drawbacks as well. And it's not an ideal one-to-one encoding of Sanskrit phonemes. Okay, so what I did in Linguistic Issues in Encoding Sanskrit, it's a book that I wrote with a colleague, Malcolm Hyman, which was just published by Motilal Banarsidass, and they've kindly come here with a bunch of other books as well. If you're interested in looking further at it, I discuss all these issues which I've been discussing in the past hour in greater detail and explicitly. And what I did was devise an encoding scheme called Sloppy 2, which is anything but sloppy. to precisely represent each Sanskrit sound by a single code. And SLP1 is a sort of basic encoding, which includes some of these faults of redundancy, but it's an adequate way of representing Sanskrit using a combination of marks. Amba used some of the same principles in devising WX. That is, the goal was to find one sound in one graphic representation or one computer code to represent each Sanskrit phoneme. This was the idea behind these encoding schemes. The idea behind Veldhuis's scheme was to find as simple as possible a method to adapt ASCII, to have an ASCII romanization. The idea was to accommodate the computer code, ASCII, which is still the most universal method of transmitting information in computational systems, to have the least invasive use of diacritics to represent romanization. Now, there are some methods of typing, of data entry of Sanskrit, which one might want to consider. Gerard mentioned that one of our motivations in going into this discussion was that we want to enable you to be able to precisely enter data in Sanskrit. Well, data entry and representation to the internal representation to the computer are two different things, right? Display is, again, something else. How many of you would like to see Sanskrit displayed in Roman script? How many want to see it displayed in Malayalam script? How many want to see it displayed in Devanagari script? How many want to see it displayed in some other script? You didn't raise your hands. What other script do you want it displayed in? Gujarati? Telugu? Okay, it can be done, right? Sanskrit can be presented any way you want it. You want to see it in Grantha script? Sure, we can put it in Grantha script. You want to see it in Devanagari? We can do that. We want to see it in Romanization? We can do that. What we need in order to do that is two things. We need a precise internal representation, and we need transcoding software. And then we can display that any way you want to read it. You want to do data entry of Sanskrit? If you're used to Roman script and you want to use a few diacritics, there's a very simple principle in the Veldhuis scheme. Almost everywhere you're going to enter a diacritic, before the sound, you use a dot or some other marks, right? A hyphen, a quote mark. There are a few marks that you use just before the symbol to represent that diacritic. Learning 5 or 6 diacritics and combination of Roman letters, very quickly you can learn the Veldhuis scheme and learn to type a precise representation using digraphs of Sanskrit. Or if you want to use WX, you want to use Sanskrit Library typing scheme, there are various modes of representing data. I hired a typist to do data entry of some Sanskrit that was written in Roman script. And this typist could type 110 words a minute. Okay, very fast, very fast. She'd worked as a secretary, as a court reporter. She knew no Sanskrit whatsoever, no Indian language whatsoever. She didn't have to know it. All I had to do was tell her, I invented a new encoding of Sanskrit just for her. I said, everywhere you see one of these diacritic marks, okay, you see a dot somewhere, type it after the letter. That's all I told her. You see a line above, type a hyphen after the letter. You see this mark above, said type a quote mark after the letter. That's all I told her. 4 signs I used. and she typed up my index, and I wrote a transcoding routine that translated from her data entry into SLP encoding, and I transcoded all her information. And then if I want to display it on the web in Devanagari, I have another transcoding program which puts it in Devanagari. So there are three separate things: internal representation, display, and data entry. And what we can do is accommodate anything anybody wants. Somebody wants to type it one way. They want to use Devanagari Unicode. They're used to using typing Devanagari Unicode. Fine. Go ahead. Type Devanagari Unicode. You're in the habit, even though it's not an ideal one-to-one representation. So what? You're used to it. It's easy. Go ahead. Use it. You're used to WX. Go ahead. Use it. You want to use Veltas? Go ahead. Use that. We'll take that data entry, we'll transcode it into an exact representation, a one-to-one encoding for linguistic processing. Why do we want a one-to-one coding? It makes writing the software a little easier. Every time we come across, if we use digraphs, every time we come across a D, we have to ask, is there an H after it? Do we want to have to do that every time we write some software? Some linguistic software, we want to ask, is there an H after this? No. What Girard does is he takes the data entry, he transcodes it into numbers, 1 to 50. And he does all his processing using numbers. He uses, where's that other chart with the numbers? Doesn't matter. You remember the numbers at the, okay. This is Girard's internal processing scheme, okay? And this is his data entry scheme.
It is for the 4 columns.
Yeah, any of these 4. You can choose any one of these 4.
This is data entry, okay? And for output, these 2.
These 2 are for display,
And
this is for internal processing. 3 different things, right? 3 different purposes, 3 different encoding schemes. Transcoding is simple, and it makes the linguistic processing easier to have a one-to-one representation, whether it's a numeric representation or a SLP representation. Actually, SLP, this is also a numeric representation, right? This is just the visual representation of that internal encoding. Okay, so what we do to implement this kind of thing is, let me just show you now the Sanskrit Library website. What we've done here, we have a transcoding scheme. So right now I've taken these, I put these 4 words here, Parvati, Shiva, Krishna, Radha, in SLP1 encoding. You can hardly see that. Can you see that? Can I make that larger somehow? Isn't that, we can Control T or something? Okay. All right, good. And let's just move this down a little bit. How do I drag that? Okay. There. Okay, now, oh well, yeah, now I can't see my other buttons. Anyway, so you can see this is Parvati, Shiva, Krishna, Radha. Now I do Control minus to go out again. I got to see my other buttons. So now we can select desired encoding here. And we want to see that in Unicode Devanagari. We click a button, and we've got it in Unicode Devanagari now. Okay? And you want to see it in Romanization. Oops. Oh. Oh, I erased them. All right. Okay. Okay, we want to see those in Unicode Roman. We can do that. So now they're in Unicode Roman, right? And if we want to see them in, somebody wanted to see them in Gujarati, no, in Telugu. You don't have a Telugu font? You're teaching Sanskrit at the University of Hyderabad and you do not have a Telugu font? This is shameful. What would the Minister of Andhra Pradesh say? What do you have? Devanagari, that's it? Preeti did all his work getting all these fonts. Let's see what you've got. Let's see if you've got Telugu. No, it's not there. I don't think. That's not Telugu, is it? All right. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay? We can. You might have Gujarati? All right. Gujarati. Yes, okay. So there we have, you can want to see your Sanskrit in Gujarati script, we can put it in Gujarati script. Okay? That doesn't look like, yeah, that's Gujarati. Okay. So that's the idea, is that we separate these three things and you just, you decide what you want to learn. You find some way of entering data, whether you use Unicode, Devanagari, or learn one of these romanization schemes. You decide which one you want, which one's easiest for you to use, and learn it, and then use that to type your Sanskrit. And if you want to shift it to something else, you can go to this page. It's on the web, and you can transcode it into whatever else you want to see it in. Okay, and I think there are some other places on our website that may be of interest to you, but we'll talk about those tomorrow, where we've included some software. So, for example, here, tools, look up headword in multiple dictionaries. Here I can type in SLP. I can type in SLP. Radha, and I can look it up in Monier Williams. And it will display the output showing Radha here in Devanagari. As you see here. But if I want to input in some other way, Kyoto, Harvard, or iTrans are the other two choices here. And output it in some other way. I have several other choices there. And tomorrow I'll show you other ways that we've expanded those choices. Let me just briefly go to... Let me go to one other place. Texts. Yeah, I'll stop in just a moment, just 30 seconds. So this is a display of some text we have at the Sanskrit Library website, and this is displayed now in Devanagari. One can go to the Preferences menu and say, well, I don't want to see that in Devanagari, I want to see that in Gujarati. And we can say here server display. Actually, maybe it doesn't look like it's allowing me to do anything but Devanagari or Romanization now. Let's see. I guess we only have those three up here now. But anyway, you can see it in Romanization if you want. And then it will take it away and display the text in Romanization. So that's our aim has been to, I don't know what it's doing now. I must have clicked some other button. All right. Yeah, anyway, you get the idea. We separated the things. You can see it. The idea is to make it so you can see it however you want it. You can enter it however you want it. And people who are writing linguistic software can have it internally represented in a consistent way for them to work with. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And we've beaten that issue of script and language and encoding to death. It should be all crystal clear now. And why we've had to deal with this issue should also be clear. And it's not just, as Gerard said, it's not just a matter of that it's been confusing and we're trying to, that we've made the confusion, you know. We didn't make the confusion. It's an inherited confusion. It's not just created in the last 2 centuries. It's a confusion which goes back to 2 millennia ago when people started representing spoken knowledge in a written form. It's a problem of the transition in the media for the expression of knowledge. And that's what we're going through now. We're going through a media transition. We're making a transition from the written medium or the printed medium to the digital medium. And since we're at the forefront of this, we have to solve the problems to get us over this transition.